Was Norway actually a poor country up until 1970? In case you're not familiar, what you need to know is that there is a lore in Norwegian culture that Norway was a impoverished nation until they found oil in 1972. It's really important to define the word lore here. As I'm a scholar of cultural history and cultural understanding, lore is not the same as myth, okay? And that nuance might get lost in translation to you Norwegians. Lore doesn't mean true or untrue. It just means a narrative that runs through a culture. So true or untrue, it is often said that Norway was impoverished, poor. Sometimes you hear a third world country until 1972. But is it true? A lot of you rushed to the comments on my last videos with your well actually, your water from the well actually. But I'm here to tell you that I'm the professor of well actually when I want to be. I just choose to select when I use those powers. So never fear, little Norway, I am here. I had been told this my whole life as well. And when I moved here, I got really curious, like, how can we date that to 1972? That's what I had specifically been told my whole life. As a historian, I was like, that seems a little bit suspect because even things like the French Revolution, we sometimes date it differently. So why is there this very specific date? So I dove into the research. And I'm here to tell you, with the water from my well actually, of curious cultural listening and deep ontological and epistemological questions, which is what I specialize in, that this question is impossible to answer. And honestly, like, my algorithm on this video is going to be so great because I love y'all in Norway, but y'all do love a black and white answer. Like the French, they love their philosophy and their wondering, and y'all want it to be clear here. Like, there's not a market for 1970s French philosophy in Norway. But that's fine, because when y'all rush to the comments to be like, they were poor, I'll be fine. Because the answer is, because I thought so too, okay? Like, I'm making fun of y'all. I also was like, how can we know it so clearly, 1972? When I started to dig into this, using my access to academic resources and my knowledge as an academic, here's what I discovered. Like so much of what I say on this channel, nothing is as clear-cut as we want it to be. I found articles supporting this lore. Yes, they were poor. I found articles debating this lore, saying it wasn't true. And there's political stakes to this, right? Because Americans in particular like to say that the wonderful things Norway has done in its social welfare system were only possible because they got sort of a reset button, that they got all this influx of cash in the modern era with modern values and could decide to do modern things with it. Therefore, it's impossible for something like that to happen anywhere else in the world. There are political stakes on both sides of this. The notion that Norway was poor and impoverished for a long time also means that people can say there's certain parts of their culture that come out of this, a certain sort of grit or something like that, self-determination, self-reliance. But what I discovered when I was diving into this is just honestly a lot less exciting than we probably want it to be. It straight up depends on how you define wealthy versus poor and who is making that judgment in comparison to what. So if you Google this, you will find many, many people trying to dispel the myth of poor Norway and showing you charts that show that Norway was maybe around average, maybe slightly below average compared to the rest of the world in the 1800s, when we generally say they were very poor. That's where you see a lot of this myth being broken. But what really changed my perspective on this and made me see that it's a much more complex question, because we still know that so many people, half the country, immigrated away from Norway because theoretically they thought there were better opportunities elsewhere. So how can that be if it wasn't a poor land? An article that you can find in teknot.no by Paul Nygård, he breaks it down perfectly. The problem is when we look at these charts of rich versus poor lands, we're looking at GDP, global domestic product, which is essentially the average income or money in a society divided by the number of people. I'm going to give you a minute to think about what that might leave out. That is essentially an average. And I was a statistician long ago. I don't talk about that often. Averages our averages, right? That's not accounting for the wealth gap. There was a ton of industry brought to Norway at the end of during the Industrial Revolution. And as a scholar of British history, I know that, yeah, that brought wealth for some people. It made a lot of people's lives a lot worse. And there's a huge urbanization move. Things got a lot harder for farmers all over Europe. So what we're talking about, were they rich, were they poor? The country as a whole might not have been poor, but there was an increasing and huge wealth gap. So these things are not so black and white. And here's the kicker, I think. This is already way too long, but here's my main point. The lore itself is important. So we can say yes and no. Norway both can and cannot be considered to have been poor prior to their discovery of oil. But what's most important and interesting to me as a cultural listening scholar is the country tells itself this myth. And it's really worthwhile to reflect on what a culture gets or takes the meaning from when they tell themselves these stories. We see a similar, different story, but a similar type of lore when we talk about America as the land of opportunity. I call it an ideology, something that I teach my students. A culture tells itself this about itself, but that might not actually be true for everyone. So America's not the land of opportunity for everyone, but it tells us what that society thinks about itself. So the lore of Norway having been a poor land is probably more valuable to reflect on, and what maybe you think Norway gets out of that. Why do we tell ourselves that? Because it both is and is not true, actually. Okay.